Imagine having a best friend so close, he was practically family. He ate at your dinner table, slept on your couch, and treated your child like his own. Now imagine walking into your home, and catching that same friend doing the unthinkable. The rage. The betrayal. The horror. For one Houston correctional officer, that nightmare became a reality. And in a split second, his instincts took over, turning his home into a crime scene. This is the shocking case of Eric Gates, a devoted father and respected officer, who made a choice no parent should ever have to make. A man sworn to uphold justice. A trusted friend who shattered that trust in the most unforgivable way. And a moment of pure rage that ended in bloodshed. Welcome to Everyday True Crime, where we uncover real-life cases that are as shocking as they are tragic. If you love gripping true crime stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Eric Gates had always believed in discipline, integrity, and loyalty, values that shaped both his career and personal life. At 42, he had spent over a decade working as a correctional officer in Houston, Texas, a job that required him to navigate some of the most dangerous and unpredictable situations daily. His uniform commanded respect, but inside the prison walls, respect wasn't given, it was earned. Eric was known for his no-nonsense approach, a man who demanded order but never abused his authority. Inmates learned quickly that he wasn't the type to be pushed around, and his colleagues saw him as someone they could rely on. He carried himself with quiet strength, a man who had seen the worst in people yet still believed in the structure of the law. But beneath the rigid discipline of his job, Eric was a father before anything else. His 15-year-old son, Jordan Gates, was his pride and joy. He had raised Jordan with the same principles that guided his work: respect, hard work, and the ability to stand his ground. Their bond was unshakable. Even when Eric was exhausted from long shifts at the prison, he made sure to be present for his son, whether that meant late-night talks about school and basketball or giving life advice that only a father could. Jordan looked up to him, not just as a dad, but as a protector, the man who made the world feel safe. Eric's marriage to Michelle Gates, 39, had its challenges, as most marriages did, but there was love and stability in their home. Michelle understood the weight of Eric's job and the stress he carried. She had been his rock, the one who balanced out the harsh realities of his career with warmth and patience. But long shifts and the emotional toll of working in corrections meant Eric wasn't home as much as he wanted to be. Michelle had learned to be independent, handling most of the day-to-day parenting. She never complained, but Eric sometimes worried that his absence left gaps in their home life, gaps that he couldn't always fill. That's where Sheriff Desmond Tate came in. At 44, Tate had spent over 2 decades enforcing the law, but unlike Eric, he didn't have a stable home to return to. His marriage had been unraveling for years, a mess of constant arguments, slammed doors, and long stretches of silence. The tension was unbearable, and Tate found himself dreading the walk through his front door. It wasn't that he didn't love his wife, maybe he did once, but the resentment had built up so high that love had no room to breathe. Eric and Tate had been friends for years, both of them men of the law, bound by their shared experiences in a world that few outsiders could understand. What started as casual work camaraderie had turned into a brotherhood. They had each other's backs, both in uniform and out. Eric was the one person Tate trusted without hesitation, and when things at home became unbearable, Eric offered him a refuge. "Come by any time," he had told him once. And Tate took that invitation seriously. At first, it was just an occasional visit, dinners with the Gates family when things got too tense at home. Then, the visits became more frequent. Tate would drop by after work, sharing a beer with Eric in the backyard while Jordan shot hoops in the driveway. He wasn't just a guest, he became part of the household. Sometimes, he crashed on the couch, too tired, or too unwilling, to go back to his own house. Michelle had been hesitant at first, unsure about the arrangement, but Eric reassured her. "It's just temporary," he'd said. "He needs a place to breathe." Jordan, on the other hand, took an immediate liking to Tate. With his father always working, Tate filled a space that Eric hadn't realized was empty. He had a natural charisma, the kind that made people feel comfortable around him. If Eric ever noticed how close they were becoming, he didn't think much of it. Tate was like family, after all. He trusted him completely. At first, it seemed harmless. Sheriff Desmond Tate had always treated Jordan Gates like a nephew, like the son he never had. He showed an interest in the boy's life, asking about school, basketball, and girls. He gave advice like an older brother might, telling Jordan how to carry himself, how to be confident. "You gotta walk like you own the room," he'd say with a grin. "That's how you make people respect you." Eric had always told his son the same thing: confidence was key. So when Tate echoed those lessons, Eric saw it as nothing more than a strong male role model reinforcing what he had already taught. He had no reason to think otherwise. But what Eric didn't know was that Tate's interest ran far deeper than mentorship. It started with the gifts. A new pair of sneakers. A watch that Jordan had been eyeing for months. A signed basketball from a local college player. "Just a little something for my favorite kid," Tate would say, ruffling Jordan's hair like an affectionate uncle. Then, the conversations became more personal. Tate talked about dating, about women, about what it meant to be a man. "You're growing up fast," he'd tell Jordan, his eyes lingering in a way that Jordan didn't fully understand. "Pretty soon, you'll be breaking hearts." The words should have been nothing more than playful banter, the kind of talk a teenage boy would hear from older male figures. But there was something else in Tate's voice, something that felt off. Jordan couldn't explain it, but it made his stomach tighten. Then came the touches. At first, they were small. A hand on the back that lingered too long. A squeeze of the shoulder. A pat on the knee when they sat too close on the couch. Jordan told himself he was imagining it. This was Tate, his father's best friend. Someone he had known for years. There was no reason to be uncomfortable. But the unease was there, creeping in like a shadow he couldn't shake. Then, one evening when Eric was working a late shift and Michelle was out with friends, Tate stayed behind after dinner. The house was quiet, just the two of them. Jordan had been watching TV, trying to ignore the way Tate kept glancing at him. And then it happened. Tate sat down beside him, too close. His hand rested on Jordan's thigh, fingers pressing in just enough to make the boy freeze. "You trust me, don't you?" Tate whispered. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, to get away. But fear held him in place. He didn't know what to do. So he said nothing. And Tate took his silence as permission. That night was the beginning of a nightmare. It didn't happen just once. It became a pattern. Tate knew exactly what he was doing. He picked moments when they were alone, when no one else was around. He made Jordan feel trapped, powerless. And worst of all, he made him believe that no one would believe him. "You know how much your dad trusts me," Tate would whisper. "Who do you think he'll believe? Me, or a kid who's confused?" The manipulation ran deep. Tate wasn't just a man of the law, he was a man who had spent decades knowing how to read people, how to control a situation, how to make sure the truth stayed buried. Jordan withdrew. The once lively, confident teenager became quiet. He avoided eye contact, flinched at unexpected touches, and no longer had the same enthusiasm for things he used to love. Eric noticed the shift but blamed it on typical teenage struggles. "He's growing up," he told Michelle when she brought it up. "Boys go through phases." Michelle wasn't convinced, but she had no idea what was really happening. No one did. The night was quiet, deceptively normal. Eric Gates had been out running errands, just a quick trip to pick up a few things before heading home. Michelle had gone to visit her sister across town, leaving Jordan alone for a couple of hours. It wasn't unusual. Jordan was 15, old enough to handle himself. But Eric would later wish, with everything in him, that he had never left his son alone that night. Desmond Tate had been waiting for an opportunity. The moment he realized Eric and Michelle weren't home, he made his move. He pulled into the driveway like he had done countless times before, parking just slightly out of view. He didn't knock like a guest. He walked in like he owned the place. Like he belonged. Jordan, sitting on the couch, heard the door open and turned to see Tate stepping inside. "Where's your father?" Tate asked, his voice as casual as ever. Jordan hesitated. He always hated this question. It was always the first thing Tate asked when he showed up unannounced. "He went out." A slow smile spread across Tate's face. That was all he needed to hear. He walked further into the house, locking the door behind him. Jordan tensed. He knew what was coming. The warning signs were all there, the shift in Tate's voice, the way his eyes darkened, the way he stepped just a little too close. "Relax," Tate said, voice low. "You trust me, don't you?" Jordan felt sick. He didn't answer. Because answering meant choosing between a lie and the truth, neither of which would save him. Tate reached out, his hand resting on Jordan's shoulder. The weight of it was suffocating. "You know I care about you," Tate murmured. "I just want to make sure you're growing up the right way." Jordan's body locked up in fear. This had happened before. But this time, something was different. Tate wasn't alone. Eric's truck rolled into the driveway, the sound of tires crunching over gravel breaking through the suffocating silence inside the house. Jordan's breath hitched. Tate froze. "Don't make a sound," he hissed. Jordan squeezed his eyes shut as Tate moved faster, fumbling with his belt, trying to pull his pants back up. The front door swung open. Eric stepped inside, keys still in his hand, plastic grocery bags hanging from his fingers. And then, he saw it. Tate. Standing there. His pants halfway up. Jordan curled into himself, his face pale, his body trembling. It took less than a second for Eric to understand exactly what he was seeing. Less than a second for the world he knew to shatter into pieces. For a moment, time stood still. Jordan barely breathed. Tate's face paled, but only for a split second before he tried to play it off. "Eric." But Eric wasn't listening. The bags dropped to the floor, forgotten. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. The room became suffocatingly small, the air thick with rage. Eric saw red. Every memory, every meal, every shared laugh, every night he let Tate sleep under his roof, flashed through his mind like a sick, twisted joke. This was the man he trusted. The man he called a brother. And he had been preying on his son right under his nose. Something inside Eric snapped. The betrayal hit him like a freight train, a violent collision of rage and disbelief. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't some faceless monster lurking in the shadows. This was Desmond Tate, his best friend, his brother in everything but blood. And he had been hurting his son. The realization burned through him like acid, scorching away every ounce of restraint. Eric lunged. The impact sent Tate crashing against the wall, a framed picture shattering on the floor beneath them. "You sick," the words barely made it out before Eric's fist connected with Tate's face. Tate grunted, stumbling but catching himself. He wasn't a small man. Years in law enforcement had made him strong, quick. He fought back. A hard elbow to Eric's ribs. A punch to the side of his head. But Eric barely felt it. The pain, the exhaustion, it didn't matter. He had the strength of a father protecting his child, the unrelenting fury of a man who had been pushed past the point of no return. Tate tried to get away, but Eric wouldn't let him. Another punch, this time to Tate's jaw. He staggered, spitting blood. I trusted you, Eric growled, his voice shaking with fury. Tate said nothing. Maybe he knew there was nothing he could say. Or maybe he was still looking for a way out. Because the second Eric's grip loosened, Tate bolted. He ran toward the kitchen, maybe for the back door, maybe for a weapon. Eric chased him. Tate's hand had barely reached for the drawer when Eric grabbed him from behind, yanking him backward and slamming him onto the counter. The kitchen was small, the space between them closing fast. Eric's eyes darted to the knife block. His fingers wrapped around the handle of the first blade he touched. The rage, the betrayal, the sheer animalistic fury took over. The first stab was wild. The second, precise. Tate gasped, his hands flying up to stop the attack, but Eric was unstoppable. Once. Twice. 3 times. The knife plunged into flesh over and over, each thrust punctuated by a choked sound from Tate's lips. By the time Eric stopped, his chest was heaving, his arms trembling. Tate lay motionless, his body slumped against the counter, blood pooling beneath him. His face, once familiar, once trusted, was now unrecognizable. Eric staggered back, the knife slipping from his fingers. His hands, his clothes, everything was soaked in blood. Jordan stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock, his body trembling. Eric turned to his son, his breathing ragged. "It's over," he whispered. The house was eerily silent except for the sound of Eric's heavy breathing. The knife had slipped from his hand, clattering to the blood-slicked tile floor. His fingers were still curled as if they were gripping it, his muscles locked in the remnants of unrelenting rage. Jordan hadn't moved. He stood frozen in the doorway, his wide eyes darting between his father and the lifeless body slumped against the counter. The teenager's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, his chest rising and falling too fast. His body trembled violently, his mind unable to process what had just happened. A loud bang shattered the silence. The neighbors. The commotion. Someone had called the police. Eric barely had time to think before red and blue lights painted the walls of his home. Sirens screamed through the night, the wail piercing through the weight of what had just happened. A heavy fist pounded against the front door. "Houston PD. Open up." Eric didn't move. He barely blinked. He just stood there, his breath shallow, his mind caught between the past and the present, between the rage that had consumed him and the sickening stillness that followed. More pounding. More shouting. "Open the door, now." Jordan flinched at the sound, his body jerking as if waking from a nightmare. He looked at his father, his lips parting like he wanted to say something, to ask something, but no words came. Eric swallowed hard and took a step forward. His fingers curled around the doorknob, slick with sweat, and turned it. The door flew open. A swarm of officers flooded the entryway, weapons raised. "Hands where we can see them." Eric didn't resist. His bloodied hands lifted in surrender, his expression blank, almost eerily calm. An officer moved in fast, grabbing his wrists and yanking them behind his back. Cold steel snapped around them with brutal efficiency. "Eric Gates, you're under arrest for murder." The words barely registered. He didn't fight. He didn't plead. He just whispered, he deserved it. The officers started to move in, but then one of them glanced toward the body. And then everything changed. The radio chatter grew frantic. Confusion turned into shock. One of the officers stiffened, his grip tightening on Eric's arm as his gaze locked onto the face of the man lying in a pool of blood. "Wait a second." Another officer moved closer, his flashlight sweeping over the gruesome scene. His face paled. "Is that?" The realization hit them all at once. Sheriff Desmond Tate. Their sheriff. Dead. Murdered. And the man standing before them, drenched in blood, was the one who did it. The room filled with stunned silence. The officers who had come in expecting a routine arrest were now staring at the body of their own sheriff. The man who had led them. The man they had worked alongside for years. "Holy," one officer muttered, stepping back. "He killed the sheriff." The weight of the moment settled over them like a suffocating fog. Eric remained still, his expression unreadable. He wasn't crying. He wasn't panicked. He just stood there, as if he had already accepted his fate. Another officer finally spoke, his voice tense. "Get him in the car. Now." The realization of who had been killed didn't change the procedure. Eric was still a murderer in their eyes. The law didn't bend, even for something as unthinkable as this. As officers swarmed the house, paramedics arrived, but there was no need for urgency. Sheriff Desmond Tate was gone. One of the officers grimaced at the scene, the brutality of the attack evident in the deep wounds and the sheer amount of blood. "This wasn't just murder," one of them muttered. "This was personal." Jordan, still visibly shaken, was led to the squad car. An officer tried to ask him questions, but the boy could barely form a sentence. He sat in the back seat, staring at his bloodied hands that weren't his father's but still felt stained just the same. Detectives arrived within the hour. They combed through the house, looking for any sign of what had led to such a violent confrontation. At first, it seemed like an open-and-shut case, a man snaps and kills his best friend in cold blood. But when they searched Tate's phone, the truth unraveled in the most horrifying way. The messages were damning. Text after text. Conversations between Tate and Jordan, ones that no adult man should ever have with a teenage boy. There were photos, sickening, undeniable evidence of a predator hiding in plain sight. The horror spread like wildfire. Whispers among the officers turned into disgusted murmurs. The sheriff they had respected, the lawman with 2 decades of service, was nothing more than a monster in disguise. And Eric had discovered it in the most brutal way possible. Despite the shocking revelations, the law was the law. Eric had committed murder, first degree, premeditated in the eyes of the prosecution. Self-defense didn't apply. Passion could only explain so much. And no matter how much the evidence painted Tate as a monster, no amount of proof could undo what had already been done. Eric was booked into the Houston Police Department, his mugshot plastered across every news station in Texas. The headline was the same everywhere. Sheriff Desmond Tate murdered by best friend, Houston correctional officer charged with first-degree murder. The community was stunned. A respected sheriff, dead. A devoted father, behind bars. And a son left with scars that would never fully heal. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the man who had once been a respected correctional officer, now standing trial for murder. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled notes, their headlines already written before the verdict was even read. Eric Gates, avenging father or cold-blooded killer. His case had become a media firestorm. Some called him a grieving father who had snapped in the face of unimaginable betrayal. Others saw him as a dangerous vigilante who had taken justice into his own hands. But the law did not deal in emotions, it dealt in facts. And the facts were simple. Eric Gates had killed Sheriff Desmond Tate in a fit of violent rage. Now, the court had to decide if that rage was justified. The defense did everything they could to humanize Eric. They painted the picture of a devoted father, a man who had worked tirelessly to provide for his family, only to have his world shattered by the ultimate betrayal. They described the moment he walked in on Tate, the moment every parent dreads but could never truly prepare for. They argued that Eric had not planned to kill anyone. He had acted in the heat of the moment, consumed by a fury so deep, so primal, that he lost control. How many parents, his attorney asked the jury, could stand in this man's shoes and say they would have done differently? The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, the jury seemed to consider them. But the prosecution struck back hard. They reminded the court that Eric had not just stopped Tate, he had butchered him. The crime scene photos were displayed for all to see, and the brutality was undeniable. This was not self-defense, the prosecutor declared. This was vengeance. The jury was visibly shaken. They deliberated for hours, the weight of the case pressing down on them. Then, finally, they returned. The courtroom fell silent. Eric sat motionless as the verdict was read. Guilty. But not of murder. Voluntary manslaughter. The sentence, 25 years in prison. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some relieved, others outraged. Eric didn't react. No tears. No outbursts. Just a slow nod, as if he had already made peace with his fate. As he was led away in handcuffs, the question lingered in the air. Was he a murderer? Or a father who did what any parent would have done? Eric trusted Desmond Tate with his family, his home, and his child. He opened his doors to him, welcomed him as a brother, and never once questioned his intentions. In return, Tate shattered that trust in the most unforgivable way. What was once friendship turned into betrayal. What was once loyalty turned into rage. A father's love became a father's fury. And in the end, it cost Eric everything. That's the tragic case of Eric Gates, a father pushed beyond his limits. Do you think his actions were justified? Or did he take things too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real-life cases. This is Everyday True Crime. Until next time, stay safe.